Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Geopolitical Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Good afternoon, good evening, and at least to one intrepid viewer in Australia, good morning. My name is Matthew Goodman. I'm Senior Vice President for Economics at CSIS in Washington. Delighted to have you with us today for this virtual book launch for The Emperor's New Road, a terrific new book by our colleague John Hillman here at CSIS. In a moment, I'm going to hand you over to Bethany Allen Ebrahimian to have a conversation with John about the book. But before I do that, let me first thank the Sloan Foundation and Smith Richardson Foundation for making the book possible. Let me also say, from the point of view of CSIS, we're just delighted that John has put out this first book. It's very much based on his work in the Reconnecting Asia project here at CSIS, which is an initiative that we started about 4 years ago that John was the founding director of. Where we have a website, a microsite. If you haven't seen it, it's at reconnectingasia.csis.org. It has a map and database of about 14,000 infrastructure projects across the Eurasian supercontinent and related analysis on the global infrastructure push that is dominating the headlines, including through the now much talked about, but not well understood Belt and Road Initiative of China, which is really where John's book comes in to help fill the gap. John, as part of his work with Reconnecting Asia, traveled the world. He certainly that region. He went to China, Russia, Central Asia, South Asia, even as far as East Africa, to do research for our project, but also along the way for the book. And he actually had as is befitting a traveler on the so-called Silk Road, he had some harrowing adventures, not quite being kidnapped by a band of armed horsemen, but the modern day equivalent. And he wound some of those stories into this book, which is partly what makes it so compelling, because it's a lot of history, a lot of data, a lot of analysis, but it's also got some really interesting stories along the Belt and Road, as it were. It's a really well-researched book, really tightly written. John's a really good writer, and this is a compelling story. I also think that this is now, the definitive book on the Belt and Road Initiative. There aren't many as well informed and comprehensive and balanced as this one is. So I really do commend it to you. With that, but you can judge for yourself, hopefully by reading the book and also by listening to this conversation. And I will hand over to Bethany. One final thing is to just say that if you would like to ask questions, you can do that by, hopefully there's a link below the screen that you can push, a button you can push, and then you can ask questions there, which Bethany will try to field at least some of those during her 40 minutes or so with John. So again, with that, thanks for joining us, and I'll now hand it over to Bethany.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Matt. And I'm very pleased to be able to talk with John today about his book. I myself, of course, have a copy, and it's very thoroughly marked up from taking copious notes. I truly enjoyed reading it. I think that John has made several important contributions to our understanding of the BRI and to the discussion around it. And I'll start just by repeating something that Graham Allison said about it on the back of it, which is that the book helps cut through the noise of our discussion and of all the information available about the BRI. And what I think is really interesting, and such a valuable thing that John has done, is to reframe our conversation from viewing the Belt and Road through the lens that Chinese propaganda has made for us, specifically by referring to the BRI as the reawakening of the ancient Silk Road routes. We could just say this in our sleep now. And instead, he has likened it to an imperial project, very similar in some ways to the big 19th century infrastructure building projects that several European and American imperial countries undertook. And so he, John argues that China's BRI is retracing the steps of previous infrastructure building empires, which brings rewards, potential rewards, but also potential risks. And here is a quote that I thought really helped, reframe that in a really simple way. China, having played the role of the weaker state, is now grappling with the challenges that accompany its rising power and expanding global footprint. Despite these imperial echoes, this is not a story about China's domination, but its education as a rising power. Because China's rise to power has occurred decades after the creation of international institutions designed to establish and enforce a set of international behavioral norms, China has also been constrained on the international stage in ways that European powers at the height of their colonial conquests were not. So there are some similarities here, there are some differences. And my first question, John, as we launch into our discussion of your book is, what are the potential rewards and the potential risks of Xi Jinping's grand imperial project?
Thanks so much, Bethany, and thanks to Matt as well. It's tempting just to kind of conclude the conversation here and not, ruin the book with my own words about it after, so many nice things have been said. But Bethany has posed, I think, really a central question. It's striking to me that maybe some of the benefits or advantages to China that this massive initiative poses are better understood to outside viewers than some of the risks, at least, for the first 7 years that many of us have been watching this. And so in the category of benefits, I think you have everything from the benefits that accrue immediately to China's companies participating in this. I think that they are the number one beneficiaries of many of these projects. China has 7 of the world's 10 largest construction companies. They are hungry to go build projects. They've built so many at home that they've run out of things to build in some cases. And so they are definitely poised to benefit from this initiative. Now, for the projects that actually are economically viable, China does stand to benefit from those connections as well. As a major exporter, improving transport connections with its neighbors, lowering the costs of global trade. There's also political benefits to China. I think we've seen a lot of that in this first phase of the Belt and Road. Some of that comes with offering actual projects. Some of it comes even just with the opportunity for countries to compete for projects. So I think China has, in some ways, accrued influence, even when it hasn't handed out projects equally and evenly. It's made friends in high places. Sometimes that has blown up, and we can talk about that in the risks category. And then I think there's also, a set of, broader strategic interests that China can advance through the Belt and Road, everything from setting standards to, in some cases, gaining access to dual use infrastructure. And so all of those, I think those potential benefits have been relatively well covered. But the risks run both ways. It's not only the recipient countries that bear the risk when they participate in these projects. And so I think China has been learning, as Bethany indicated, and it's been, in some cases, really bearing significant financial and reputational costs of doing these big projects. It's picked a tool for influence, large projects that are really difficult to deliver. Even in the best business environments, most large projects cost more than expected, take longer than expected, and deliver fewer benefits than expected. So if you were going to go, sort of launch a massive initiative to improve your standing in other countries, mega projects might not be the best way to do it. And in many cases, I think China, by going this alone, has been repeating the mistakes of countries that have gone before it, as Bethany mentioned. And it's telling because many of the countries that made those mistakes ended up deciding to band together to share reputational and financial risk through multilateral institutions. Although China is experimenting with some of that now, it's still overwhelmingly doing these projects by itself. And I think really does stand to hold the bag financially and reputationally going forward.
Can you give maybe a couple of specific examples? Because as you said, you traveled to 16 different countries, and I don't know of anyone who has seen so many of these projects up close in real life. Can you give an example of a project or two in which China is actually facing some of these risks? Not the risks like we think of debt trap diplomacy, poor Sri Lanka, but what are the risks that China's facing?
Well, I think even with that case in Sri Lanka, we could talk about some of the risks that China faces. So, in the Sri Lankan case, I spent a whole chapter of the book talking about this. I think we have made it into almost a spy thriller in sort of suggesting that China masterfully drove up debt levels in Sri Lanka to take a strategic asset. That's incredibly sophisticated economic statecraft. And the more that you look at this case, the more you start to appreciate how many competing actors there were and how often chaotic, not strategic it was. And so while I think it's possible that Chinese officials considered a scenario in which Sri Lanka could not pay back its loans, I think it's very unlikely that was their number one objective going into this. And so, just talking about Hambantota for a moment, this is a port that China now has a 99-year lease on. It's a port with very little economic activity. It's a port in a country that still has its sovereignty. This is not the 19th century. China can't just show up with warships there. It does need to have that cleared. It's in a neighborhood that includes some other rising powers that are closely watching this, and to which the United States has a maritime presence. And Hambantota has really become a stain on the reputation of China's Belt and Road. Countries, I think, recipient countries participating in this have become much more cautious about doing these big projects. To give one other example, in Myanmar, a port was renegotiated. Initially proposed to cost $7.2 billion. Negotiated down to about 1.2. Not the same port was agreed upon at the end of the day, but that's also a good outcome. So countries, I think, are bringing more skepticism to projects that Chinese companies are proposing. They're much more cautious about some of these debt dynamics, even though some of these political challenges still remain, and China's sort of the opaque nature of Belt and Road is allowing those risks to continue to fester.
So my second question is going to be, I think, on a related theme, which is, and it comes from a quote I appreciated in your book: "The BRI is a global initiative, but its contours depend on local context." What is that local context?
So I think when some of us were introduced to the Belt and Road Initiative, or, if for people who've only sort of heard about it in passing, maybe you've seen a map of the Belt and Road, and maybe you've seen these swooping economic corridors coming out from China, and it looks, in that picture, I think lots of things are interesting about that picture, but one of them is that borders sort of fade to the background. This idea that the friction at the borders is not as real as it actually is. And in reality, the countries participating in this initiative are shaping what projects actually look like on the ground. Every project is a negotiation, sometimes a struggle, to include competing interest groups within individual countries to decide, whose communities is this road going to connect, who's going to get some of the subcontracting, whose workers are going to be employed. And all of that, I think, gives these projects a local character, even though many of them are being built, in some cases, by literally the same prime contractors, large Chinese companies. And so you do see different outcomes. In Kenya, for example, you see environmental groups pushing back on some projects and using the legal system to actually get some of them suspended and canceled. You see in other places independent journalists looking into projects and I think really shining a light on them. And then in some other places, you don't see as much scrutiny. And unfortunately, I think those are some of the areas that are more prone to have some of the worst cases that we often read about.
You mentioned also that, as I included earlier, that China is constrained in some ways by international norms and institutions, but it has also sought to kind of avoid them. You know, like you said, it's going out on its own. It's doing this on its own. It's not necessarily trying to, balance out the risk or, spread the risk out onto multiple people that it's working with together. Why has Xi Jinping struck out alone on this initiative?
It's a great question, because there's also at the same time, there's a lot of effort that's put into these gatherings, whether it's the, every 2-year gathering for Belt and Road, or a lot of regional gatherings, the 17+1 in Central and Eastern Europe. And there's a lot of effort that's put into those events to give them the kind of the gloss of multilateralism. You get statements from participants saying that multilateralism is very important to them. You get photo opportunities with several leaders. But in reality, those are very efficient fora for China to do deals, which it overwhelmingly does bilaterally. And so I think it's done that intentionally because it always wants to be the stronger negotiating partner at the table. And when countries come together, it doesn't have quite as much leverage. And it's done this alone to benefit its companies as well. The more, if it decided to put more financing through multilateral institutions, Chinese companies would still do well because they have many advantages, state support and so on. But they would not do quite as well as they do when it's, literally the contract is, the financing is contingent on hiring them. So I think there's a lot of self-interest and a lot of sort of short-term incentives for doing that. But I do think that increases the risk because, if you're not sharing the benefits, you're not sharing the risk either.
You're right that, the world really has a stake in this too. And, if China puts in a lot of funds, investment, and a lot of energy and, its natural resources, its, labor resources into all these projects, and a lot of them fail, not only are those countries worse off, China's worse off, everybody's worse off. So in some ways we want them to be successful. But if China is learning and it's getting better and it's avoiding some of these pitfalls, or it's learning how to avoid some of these pitfalls, then it's going to be more successful in the geopolitical aspect of this. It will be more influential. And we are concerned about that because the kind of influence that it's bringing is oftentimes it's authoritarian, or it doesn't support some of the values that the world has tried to uphold in the 20th century. So we have a little bit of a paradox here. We don't want China to fail, but we also kind of don't really want them to succeed. What does your research say about that conundrum?
It's a central, I think it's a big question, and it's one that I grapple with a little bit toward the end of the book. I think the Belt and Road has been slowing down in part because of internal constraints in China as well as external constraints. So in the internal category, you have everything from fewer foreign exchange reserves to, I think, an appreciation among some policymakers that these projects actually are riskier than they realized. And you have, in the sort of external category, a rising awareness of risks among recipients, limited room to borrow, especially now in the aftermath of the pandemic. And so Belt and Road was already slowing down pre-pandemic. I think the pandemic will probably solidify that trend. And we're looking at, most likely a project pipeline that is smaller. And the opportunity there for both sides, both for China and countries participating in this, is to do a little bit more quality control. And so if the result is that there are more economically viable projects that are passed, and that countries participating in this benefit more from the growth of those projects, then I think that could be a positive outcome. And if there are fewer environmental impacts, but I think there's an open question to that right now. At the most recent Belt and Road Forum, Xi Jinping, I think his speech was really directed at addressing a lot of criticism of the Belt and Road, to include, low environmental standards, lack of financial, lack of fiscal sustainability. And so a lot of the right things were said, and a lot of fancy sounding initiatives were rolled out. Over 11 initiatives with the word green in them rolled out in the forum, but none of them are binding. None of them are really transparent. And so I think there's a really I think more than healthy skepticism should be brought to a lot of those promises. So unfortunately, I don't think China is there yet in terms of raising some of those standards. It's sort of still in the moving from awareness to action phase. And I worry that it might have to make more mistakes before it finally gets there.
Yeah. You're talking about sort of the trajectory of the Belt and Road and how it's kind of transforming. And I like that frame because, when it was first launched in 2013, the BRI 1.0, as people like to call it, it was quite limited. It was, building some roads across Central Asia, which was the Belt, confusingly, and then building some ports in Southeast Asia, which was the Road. But then there was the Belt and Road 2.0, which is what we know and love now, this sweeping geopolitical, China at the center, hub and spokes kind of model. But you put forward, and I don't think you call it Belt and Road 3.0, but I do. But you where it's going next. And I like the analogy or the picture that you draw using the metaphor of a Chinese painting that there's a style of Chinese painting where there's these broad, brush strokes that are even kind of blurry that, get at a sense of emotion, but they're not very specific. But it seems to be, and Xi Jinping has said this himself, that they need to move to some sort of more specific, detailed, more careful kind of drawing. And the idea is that maybe they're going to try to make it a little bit less opaque. Tell us more about that. Where is it going?
This has been, I think, one of the major challenges since the Belt and Road was announced. One of the things that gave it such momentum out of the gate is that there was no definition for what a Belt and Road project was. And so, many groups and competing interests could call their thing that they care about a Belt and Road thing. And so that's why you have examples from within China, fashion shows, and cartoon exhibits, to dentistry, saying that should be part of the Belt and Road, to plenty of groups outside China. Someone organizing a marathon in Serbia, like a Belt and Road marathon, that don't, to me, have a lot to do with the core element here. Yes, people-to-people connectivity is part of this, but there was a lot of, I think, rent-seeking activity. And that it made this, which Xi Jinping has called a project of the century, it made it a management nightmare. If you can't tell what's inside this thing, you can't tell what's outside of it. If people are using the brand however they want, that also carries some risk as well. And so I think there's been a desire, as this pipeline shrinks again, to maybe start to consider a little bit more quality control. But the apparatus, literally the personnel and people to manage this thing in the Chinese bureaucracy has been lacking. There just are not enough Chinese officials monitoring projects overseas. They don't have the footprint to do that effectively. And so they're deferring a lot to Chinese state-owned enterprises who have their own interests. And so you see this as a thing that it started off in broad strokes. The brush was kind of taken over by other people, and sort of, they colored it as they wanted to. And now, if China does want to assert more control over this, I think they will have to come up with more mechanisms, invest in the staffing to do it, to manage this project of the century.
some of the, I guess, perhaps BRI projects that come to mind are like what's it called, the Health Silk Road, which Xi Jinping has talked about in the wake of the coronavirus. There's some stuff with genetics, like the Genetics Belt and Road project. How would you classify those? I mean, is that part of it, or is that just like basically rent seeking or something else?
Well, so the Health Silk Road is fascinating because it really wasn't a priority until after a pandemic happened. And so if you go back to one of the original Belt and Road policy documents in 2015, this is a roughly 15 page document, and cooperation on health policy gets about a paragraph in that. And one of the things mentioned is we should exchange information, to improve pandemic preparedness. Well, clearly, that wasn't done. It wasn't done effectively. And so this has been rolled out now, I think, in part to compensate for, Beijing's mismanagement, its own sort of mishandling of the pandemic in the first place. And it's been, I think what's sort of fascinating, and this gets back to the political influence aspect, there's almost been a Belt and Road echo chamber of countries that have been big participants in this effort. And China has been able to get endorsements from them for its response to the pandemic. It's been able to get them to praise the Health Silk Road. So, everywhere from Serbia to Ethiopia to Pakistan, these are very active participants, and they needed support too. And so countries are willing to, write Health Silk Road into an MOU if they might get support in a time of need. But that idea, this Health Silk Road, is still somewhat fuzzy. There hasn't been like a hard health infrastructure component along the Belt and Road. And in fact, one of the few examples that I've found, at least, it's a hospital near Gwadar port in Pakistan, serving the vast majority of its patients are Chinese patients. They're workers who are working near the project. So I don't think it's a model example of a project that was built for local people in Pakistan. So this, I think, what your question gets to is also something interesting, which is that this is constantly evolving. This is one of the benefits of making it so vague. It can be tailored to suit the circumstances of the moment. But I think we should also, again, let's bring some skepticism to these labels and ask, what are you really talking about? What's included in this? And show me the data.
I'd like to remind viewers that you can submit questions. If you go to the event page, there is a link where you can put in a question, and we will, in a few minutes, be switching to the Q&A portion of the conversation. I have another question for you, and I quoted you earlier saying that this is not a story about China's domination, but its education as a rising power. And I think that, the fact that we even are talking about that, this is not a story about China's domination, it shows how much of a backlash there is, at least in the West and perhaps other countries, against this whole initiative. How is that? I mean, is that intentional on China's side? Is that a mistake? I mean, are they, is that part of Xi Jinping's goal, or would he have been, better served to be less overt in his big imperial plans?
Yeah, it's everything from the maps that are published, those maps that are referred to with the big sweeping corridors on them. I think on the one hand, it's there's a lot of details to fill in there, but something that's also kind of surprising is how not alarmed some of the world has been when those maps are released. I mean, literally, it's a depiction of a Sino-centric world in which the corridors are going to and from China, and that should set off. It shouldn't just be all about economics if those are the maps. I think we need to consider some of the geopolitical implications as well. I think the Belt and Road to Chinese officials have been, at least in their remarks, attempting to address some of these criticisms. So I mentioned Xi Jinping's speech at the Second Belt and Road Forum. I think what's unfortunate right now in particular is that there's not really, when it comes to multilateralism, there's not really, we're lacking a authentic alternative. So it becomes easier for China to have these fake multilateral gatherings and call them multilateral. It becomes easy, for China to make pledges on the environment, for example, and going carbon neutral when there's not a authentic competing alternative that's putting environmental standards higher. So I think that some of the backlash is definitely real. I think this year in particular is going to be very difficult for the Belt and Road. I mean, this is the great renegotiation. More projects are probably being renegotiated than negotiated in the aftermath of the pandemic, but it's not going away. It's in the Chinese Communist Party constitution. This is Xi Jinping's signature foreign policy vision, and so I think they'll continue to push it abroad, even if they talk about it a little bit less at home.
That is exactly what I want to ask about there, the conversation inside of China. So you mentioned some parallels between Japan's big infrastructure building push in the 80s and the 90s, and how corruption really became a part of it. And so there were people inside of Japan who really, there was a big backlash to that, and so there were domestic, elements in Japan that helped make its infrastructure projects abroad have more transparency and just be, be better projects. China is a different country. It's not democratic. What do you see the conversations inside of China around the Belt and Road? Not the top-down propaganda, but what are some of the conversations that are happening? But it's hard. I know it's hard to say because China is authoritarian. But if you have a sense of that.
Well, in recent months, it hasn't been as frequently mentioned in high-level meetings, and so that makes sense to me. I mean, if you're responding to a pandemic, and this is, I think, one of the risks that is kind of impossible to know with precision. But there's a risk for China too in pursuing these big foreign activities of resentment growing at home. I mean, it's very easy for us to understand, I think, if the United States were to announce a $1 trillion foreign infrastructure plan tomorrow, I think some people would be saying, well, what about, the road outside my house, or what about, the rail system in this region? And so I think that there's a risk there, especially as China's growth has slowed, that people might have less patience for this big set of foreign activities. But again, at the same time that that's happening domestically, Belt and Road's still showing up on all of these statements, meetings with Russia, meetings with leaders in Central Asia. So it's still very much on the international agenda.
Great. So I will now turn to the Q&A side. We have a lot of great questions. I don't think I'm going to be able to get to all of them, but I will try. Let's see, you've addressed that one already. China receives a lot of criticism for perceived shortcomings in BRI projects. How much of this criticism should instead be directed at the decision makers in the countries that borrow from Chinese banks or are involved with Chinese SOEs?
So I think that some of the criticism, when this is viewed in a U.S. versus China lens or a just China lens, we do overlook the agency of recipient countries, which is where I think ultimately a lot of the solutions reside. That doesn't in any way absolve China of responsibility. I think it could do things tomorrow if it wanted to improve some of these project outcomes and limit the risks. To begin with transparency. China is almost always, if not always, when it does these negotiations, the stronger party at the negotiating table. If it wanted to push for more transparent terms, it could do that. If it wanted to release tomorrow detailed information about its loans, it could be information at the same standards, the World Bank and others release. There's established practices for this. They wouldn't need to invent them. It could do that. And in doing that, it could limit corruption. It could improve public oversight of these projects. But it hasn't. And so it says things like the Belt and Road is a sunshine initiative, but it does all these deals in the dark. And so I do think, yes, both sides have some responsibility, but I also don't want to suggest that it's also only just recipient countries in China. The international community, I think, can do things here to help improve some of these outcomes, providing technical assistance to recipient countries to help make them their own best advocates. So there's responsibility in all directions. Some of these challenges are almost universal around large projects and corruption in particular. But the more transparency we could get, the better.
Okay. See, the next one we have is, what do you assess is the BRI's impact on US access to South and Southeast Asia? They don't specify what kind of access, but I think economic, but I also wouldn't mind you getting into potential military dual use issues, reports.
So I think in Southeast Asia, it's going to depend on the countries that we're talking about. One of the underappreciated realities on the ground, I think at least underappreciated in the United States, is that in many places, China is not even the largest spender for infrastructure projects. Japan regionally is outspending China in terms of infrastructure. And so I think that's just a reality on the ground. I think sort of big picture, if you look at maps and look at the corridors that are proposed and being pursued, China is working north-south and Japan is working east-west, trying to pull commerce to the coastlines. And so I think there's competition definitely over individual projects, but when it's done correctly, there's also opportunities for the countries in that region to benefit from both. The former finance minister of Indonesia, for example, has gone on the record and says this is a great competition for us. We get better financial packages when we have this competition happening. So I'm not sure if that got at it, but and I do think, as you mentioned, Japan's experience in the region is definitely something that China could learn from.
Well, what I hear you saying is that there doesn't really seem to be an access issue for the US, although I'm not really sure how interested the US is in selling infrastructure projects in Southeast Asia. But what I hear you saying is really, it's more like a marketplace almost, a pretty open one, in fact.
Yeah, I think again, it's going to depend on the countries that we're talking about. But the United States is still a major investor, in terms of FDI. It's not doing the huge as many big publicly visible infrastructure projects, but it's not in any way out of the game. So it's much more fluid than that. And then there are also the Asian Development Bank is a major player. The World Bank is active as well. So there's definitely competition, and I think actually that tends to lead to better outcomes.
Okay. I have a couple more questions, audience questions I'm going to ask you. My final question, I'm just telling you in advance so I don't spring it on you. I'm going to ask you to leave the audience with one anecdote from any country that you went to, whatever struck you the most in your mind that you think is colorful and helps illustrate some of these points. So you can be thinking on that. A couple more questions here from the audience. Can you speak a little to the digital Silk Road? What is it, and how does it relate to Huawei, TikTok, and other Chinese tech firms?
So I think this is something that's increasingly important. This is part of, as you would call it, BRI 3.0. And in particular, after the pandemic, I think there has been and will continue to be more emphasis on digital infrastructure, digital infrastructure has been there all along, and sometimes we just haven't paid as much attention to it. So things like fiber optic cables are often laid alongside roads and rail projects when they're built, just because it's easier to do it that way. Ports involve digital infrastructure. The port in Piraeus, Greece, that Costco, a major Chinese state-owned shipping company, runs, after they took it over, they put out a tender for redoing the network there, and lo and behold, Huawei won the tender, and that network is now Huawei equipment. If you get off from a cruise ship, the port of Piraeus, you might get free Huawei Wi-Fi in that area. So digital infrastructure has been part of that package that we might not always think about as digital. But I think for several reasons, it's going to be even more important going forward. So one of them is the fact that digital projects tend to cost less. And so that's just recipient countries have less room to borrow right now and to do these projects. They're often easier to monetize. They're faster to deliver. So, a fiber optic cable between China and Pakistan was laid in about 2 years, and hundreds of kilometers of cable through very difficult terrain. It's not as disruptive to the surrounding area. So there are these operational advantages. It requires fewer Chinese workers, which in today's political post-pandemic environment might be preferable. So all of those are advantages, and in particular, now as Huawei and other Chinese companies have increased scrutiny in Western markets, they need to go into these developing and emerging markets to grow. And so Belt and Road is, a very convenient banner for them to grab onto to do that. So I think we're going to see them try to double down in those markets.
From what you saw in your travels, do you think that these projects are making people's lives better?
So I think it depends on the project. For every Hambantota port, there are a whole bunch of rural road projects that no one has ever heard about. And I was able to do a pretty good, cross-country trip in Sri Lanka over some of those roads. And, those roads are where life happens in some of those communities. And so hugely important, just not as well publicized. We do tend to hear about the things that go wrong. And that's deserved for some of these projects. So it does depend on the project. And some of these projects, it's going to take a while, honestly, still to know how viable they are. 7 years since this initiative has been going on. Seems like it might be a long time, but in the world of large infrastructure projects, it's really not that long at all.
Okay, I have one last audience question here, and I like it. How has the BRI affected the landscape for international development? What should U.S. development companies expect? So
I think the old system in which the multilateral institutions, the World Bank, Asian Development Bank, and others were the only actors, sort of the actor of last resort. That's no longer the case. So for many countries, China is not their preferred partner, but it is their last resort. It's the only offer on the table to do these projects. So I think that has shifted things, and I think there's also a need for those older organizations to become more competitive. So to do things like, yes, maintain your environmental and social impact goals, but consider doing it with a little bit less paperwork and red tape, just to be able to add some speed and competitiveness. And I think the same thing is true with U.S. companies. We often don't think of U.S. companies doing these projects, but many of them are providing related services around them. So if it's legal services or if it's consulting, there are obviously companies that are very strong in the digital and the tech sector. So I think the competition has definitely changed, and it's not the developing world of last century. These are countries that are much further along and have higher expectations.
Yeah. Well, with that, I'm going to go back to the question that I asked you about some colorful anecdote to leave the viewers with today.
So this is hard. I went on some really incredible trips, and I've been thinking about them a lot too, just because we've been unable to travel. I find myself looking at some of these photos back when travel was possible, and one of my favorite adventures was It was, first of all, finding the boat to get from Kazakhstan to Azerbaijan across the Caspian Sea. So I thought it was showing up in one port, and then I found out it was showing up in a different port. You can't buy tickets for this thing in advance, so you kind of need to find the people who are running it. So I spent 3 days doing that, and I got lucky. I found the boat. I got on the boat. It was me and a European hiker who was walking across the Eurasian supercontinent, and 4 Russian bikers, motorcyclists, who were getting their bikes across the Caspian. And this is not a fast trip. So if your goal is to do this efficiently, just fly. It takes about an hour to fly. It took about 32 hours on the ship, but they let us go everywhere, on top of the ship, and it was beautiful. And after you're out there for long enough, even the borscht that they serve you in the cabin tastes good. So I'd highly recommend that trip for people when things open back up.
That sounds like quite an experience. I would like to see those photos. I bet they'd be really, really beautiful of the water.
Yeah, it was incredible. Nothing around.
Wow.
Really incredible.
Well, with that, thank you so much for your research, for your hard work, and for this conversation today. I really enjoyed speaking with you about your book.
Thanks so much, Bethany. Thanks for doing this.